Hello, everyone. You're listening to the 805 Uncensored. We are a show on the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. This podcast covers a variety of topics from music to politics, news, philosophy, and more. There are no limits, which is why we call ourselves Uncensored. So, welcome. Please follow us on your podcast and social media platforms of choice. This is episode number 109, and joined with us, we have Jenny and Melissa from Parents Against Santa Susana Field Laboratory. So, I'll hand it over to you. Please, one at a time, introduce yourselves, talk about your organization, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having us. We're excited to be here. My name's Melissa Bumstead, and I grew up in Ventura County. I'm now in Los Angeles County, but right on the border. I I never heard about the Santa Susana Field Lab. Nobody talked about it my whole childhood, and it wasn't until I moved to the Los Angeles side. My 4-year-old daughter was diagnosed with an incredibly rare, very aggressive form of leukemia. And at Children's Hospital, we started meeting other families who also lived around us and whose kids also had rare cancers. We knew that wasn't normal. Um, so we started mapping ourselves on Google Maps, and we realized that we all lived within just a few miles of the Santa Susana Field Lab. I started reaching out to epidemiologists and scientists and other NGOs and found out that the site has been well studied and the harm that it is causing to the community is well documented. Just nobody was talking about it. And so, with the little capacity that I had, I just took one step in front of the other, trying to get the word out and maybe try to make a difference. It's been almost 10 years. We've grown to thousands of supporters. We are fighting the Boeing company, NASA, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Toxic Substances Control, a California regulating agency. And we're just a group of parents who really care, and we don't want to see any other kids get cancer. So that's my little intro. Jenny.
Melissa, you have to tell them that Grace is doing well.
Oh yeah, everybody asks, and it's such a great question, and I appreciate it. Yes, thank you. My daughter is almost 16 now. Are you editing this at all, Jordan? We didn't even ask.
I do minor editing
You want
if
me to
it's
clap? I have a
sure,
podcast lady. She always says clap.
sure.
I'm sorry. My daughter is 16 now. She's doing amazing. She is literally a walking miracle. And we are so grateful for the anonymous donor who donated their bone marrow and saved her life.
Beautiful.
I'm Jenny Knack. I live in Simi Valley on the other side of the hill that the Santa Susana Field Lab sits upon. I moved out here in 2018 from Hollywood, looking for a nice, quiet place, planning on hiking all the time and picking out paint colors. But I had joined a Simi Valley Moms Facebook group, and Melissa had made a post that she was doing a protest in front of City Hall. There were concerns about the city wanting to use groundwater or more groundwater, as it were, for its drinking water, and that was an issue because there were concerns that the groundwater could be contaminated by the Santa Susana Field Lab groundwater.
Mm,
So I went up to City Hall and I saw Melissa standing on the corner with a lot of posters, and the posters had images of, bald children, attached to wires. And I had my own 3-year-old in tow at that time, and it struck me at my core. I was hoping that she was crazy and that she was a conspiracy theorist. Unfortunately, I turned around and saw a former colleague from Friends of the Los Angeles River. And I said, "Bill, what is this? What is going on?" And I guess he had a relative that worked at the site. He had documented the history and followed the history of the Santa Susana Field Lab and its issues for a very long time. It was a hobby of his. And he said that I had to go talk to Melissa. I did not want to go talk to Melissa, but I did. And I asked her if she could cite the sources for some of the very large claims she was making, which she will discuss here soon. And unfortunately, she did. She followed up with a bunch of citations, and sitting down reading those citations that night changed the trajectory of my life as well.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for both sharing your stories. It's pretty inspiring, really.
Oh, thank you.
I'm glad that your daughter's doing better too.
Me too. Thank you. We buried many of her friends but I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for her. So thank you.
So I'm just going to do a brief introduction before we dive into some of the questions. The Santa Susana Field Laboratory, formerly known as Rocketdyne, is a 2,850-acre complex of facilities that's located in the Simi Valley Hills, 30 miles northwest of downtown LA. The entire community of Canoga Park, a predominantly Spanish-speaking area, sits within 5 miles of the lab, and SSFL was used mainly for the development and testing of liquid propellant rocket engines for the U.S. space program from 1949 until 2006, nuclear reactors from 1953 to 1980, and the operation of a U.S. government-sponsored liquid metals research center from 1966 to 1998. As far as an environmental contamination summary, and I am leaving out some information here just because there's a lot of it, but I think, gathered a good bit here. It says decades of unsafe pollution management created a health hazard that would endanger neighbors for years to come. Engineers mounted engines on platforms, then burned liquid rocket fuel in thousands of tests. Workers flushed engines with solvents that flowed into the ground, eating away asphalt and draining into unlined ponds. Chemicals eventually contaminated the groundwater and a nearby creek. And to get rid of waste, workers regularly burned it in open pits. They also fired rifles at barrels full of chemicals until they exploded, which sent huge toxic plumes into the air. A million gallons of trico, I'm going to try to pronounce this, I'm probably going to struggle, but a million gallons of trichloroethene, a carcinogenic solvent, was used to flush rocket engines after tests and allowed them to percolate into the ground and groundwater. A witch's brew of dozens of other toxic chemicals, including PCBs, dioxins, heavy metals, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and semi-volatile organic compounds, SVOCs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and perchlorate, has contaminated soil, groundwater, and surface water. And a 2012 $40 million multi-year radiation survey by the EPA found hundreds of Santa Susana locations contaminated with radionuclides, including strontium-90, cesium-137, and plutonium-239. Um, and then there was also a partial meltdown in 1959 of the sodium reactor experiment. In 1959, operators pushed one of the lab's nuclear reactors past its limits, causing a partial meltdown of the core. And scientists later estimated that the amount of some radioactive materials released in the incident exceeded those from the notorious 3 Mile incident, which exposed an estimated 2 million people to small doses of radiation 2 decades later, in the 1970s. After a power excursion, that is an undesired and rapid increase in power level in the reactor core, operators were barely able to shut it down. Although they could not identify the cause of the problem, the reactor was inexplicably started back up and ran for 10 more days in the face of rising radiation levels and clear indications of fuel damage. When the reactor was finally shut down, a third of the fuel elements were found to have experienced melting. And like all the reactors of the Santa Susana site, the sodium reactor experiment had no containment structure. During and after the accident, radioactive gases were pumped into the reactor from the reactor into the atmosphere. And even so, leakage into the reactor room was so severe that the building's loading doors were open to vent the contamination outside. According to John Pace, who was one of the workers at the site, and over the years, at least three other Santa Susana reactors experienced accidents involving radiation releases and or significant field damage. So that was his consensus. One of the workers at SSFL claimed that the meltdown in 59 was on the verge of a catastrophic explosion that would have been akin to a U.S. Chernobyl. Pace and other workers were instructed to open the exhaust stacks, which released massive amounts of radiation into the sky. He said, quote, "This was very dangerous radioactive material. It went straight out into the atmosphere and went straight to Simi Valley, to Chatsworth, to Canoga Park," end quote. Pace and his coworkers tried frantically to repair the damaged reactor. Instead, they were ultimately just releasing more radioactive gas. And for weeks, often in the cover of the night, Pace and other workers were ordered by their bosses to release contamination. The workers naturally felt awful for what they were doing, but in their minds, they were simply following orders, which are two words that have had very devastating consequences throughout history, as we're well aware of. So, before I dive into any questions, any thoughts on all that info?
Yeah, it's dumpster fire is a good start. Um, there was just this sense, the Santa Susana Field Lab started right after World War II, and they actually the race for space was considered their way of saving America, from the Russians. And I think there were a lot of workers who didn't know the full extent of what they were working with. A lot of it was censored. A lot of it, code words were used. They weren't told what to do. So when someone said, do this, and they followed orders, many of those workers had no idea the consequences. And many of them suffered consequences themselves in their own bodies from what they were exposed to unknowingly. But even past that, and again, the energy, similar to what we're seeing today, where there's this push by energy corporations to say, nuclear energy is the only solution, which Jenny and I have a lot to say about that, and it is that they're liars. This push to bypass safety and regulation and public health and worker safety, it was all in this idea of something greater and grander, and sacrificing the few for the many. But time and again, we see that that hasn't really benefited very much, at least not when corporations do it to unknowing workers, unknowing public, and that is exactly what's happened today. And even when they knew better, they still they still pushed past, uh, what was right. And even when the emergency was over, they still pushed the limits of, what was safe, what was environmentally safe, worker safety, public health. It was just, uh, it's really, it's really depressing, because I think it is a classic case of corporate greed, and seeing the harm that that causes, when that is not kept in check, and when that is not, held to regulation. And maybe Jenny can tell us a little bit too about, the regulator in California. We have all these California, great environmental laws, but they're not enforced. And the regulators, these agencies, are also very weak.
That isn't what I was thinking. What I was thinking about speaking to was this idea, if we're talking about back then,
Hmm.
was the idea that, piggybacking on what Melissa said, there was this race, right? We wanted to do the right thing for the right reasons, but we didn't think about the consequences, and we weren't careful. So when I think of scientists, I think of, people who think in different ways, and we give them these keys to go ahead and do it, right? They're doing things that maybe their subordinates and even sometimes colleagues don't understand, and maybe they don't even understand the consequences of what they're doing or the long-term ramifications. Because the scientists then, they go on to the next thing. But here we can see that there is still this difficulty in understanding that you can have pride in aerospace and pride in, what we've done at different points in time, but still have the desire to hold people accountable for the health impacts that contamination caused. And it doesn't, there's a difficulty in, um, I think, holding space for both of those things. Even today, here in Simi Valley, I think some people fight the cleanup because their parents worked at the lab, and
It's
it's difficult
difficult.
for people to say yes. There is pride in
Hmm.
the scientific progress made, but we need to be accountable for the cleanup.
The Cold War propaganda and keeping up with the space race is particularly fascinating to me because I think that there is a lot of truth to that. I think that, the timing, as you mentioned, Melissa, coming shortly after World War II, um, it's the nuclear race against the Soviets. There's like quote unquote one clear enemy. We're living in at that point, a bipolar world with two superpowers. I understand what happened there and how deeply psychologically damaging that was for the workers, and not to mention the contamination from the disasters itself. First question is, What are some of the tactics that Parents Against SSFL have implemented to bring awareness to this issue?
It's a very hard issue. What we're talking about is, I think, paralyzing to a lot
Hmm.
of people psychologically. We're talking about children with cancer. As a parent, there is no greater fear. We're talking about living near a heavily contaminated site. I know I can't afford to move away. I've tried, um, and many of us can't, and many of us shouldn't have to. But that's another story. It's been so difficult coming in to not terrify people into paralysis and to educate. And when I first started this, it really seemed like it was just two scientists. We had Committee to Bridge the Gaps, Dan Hirsch, who, helped discover the meltdown and helped fight back for these protections. And then on the other side, we had government scientists and paid for Boeing scientists, paid by Boeing scientists. And it seemed like when I walked into my first meeting about this, trying to see if the Susana field lab could have caused my daughter's cancer. I was there with 6 other cancer moms, and everybody was shouting at each other. And it kind of felt like, how, like, scientists argue over if eggs are good for you or not? Like, every week it changes. Eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. It just felt like maybe this is just a difference of opinion, and it wasn't until we started mapping ourselves and started to realize, no, this is wrong. I realized what we needed to do was to have faces to go with these stories and with these statistics. So we started asking all the cancer moms to start sharing their kids' photos and stories online. I think that's what really changed the dynamic of this whole fight. Instead of it being statistics, it was about protecting our kids, and people's hearts started to change and people's hearts started to move. We also use a lot of art and humor to try to lighten the mood a little bit because we know how absurd this is that it's happening here. And we know, again, how overwhelming it can be, especially if you feel powerless to do
Hmm.
something about it, which many people, especially people who've been involved with this for a long, long time, community members, they just say, what can we do? This is our life, and we just have to take it. We don't like that attitude, and we fight it with humor. That's why our logo, a lot of people point out our logo is funny because we're trying to kind of break through people's assumptions about what they know. And I think the best tool we have right now is a documentary called In the Dark of the Valley. Um, Jenny and I got to participate in that. It was brilliant. It was Emmy nominated. It was online for a long time. NBC took it off, and we don't have the rights to it. We're working to get that back. So hopefully, when that comes out again, we can let you know and let viewers know that that might be available to watch. Because it does a really good job of matching the science with the emotion and seeing how it's hurting people, but also seeing that it's not just emotion, it's factual. It's really hard to pull off, and this
So,
documentary does a great job.
do you think that that's just blatant censorship, or why would NBC do that?
I heard it was because I guess they had a demerger, and they let go the person who was in charge of it. But we do know that even when it was up for an Emmy nomination, you would think that they would want to put some money behind that to advertise that it was Emmy nominated on their network, and they never did. And I couldn't tell you why, but it was disappointing.
I like to add that when we talk about tactics to do educational outreach, Melissa will do anything. She will stand on freeway
Pretty much.
overpasses, street corners, she'll put stickers up anywhere. There's no, I'm too old for this or I'm too accomplished for this. She will do anything. She'll knock on any doors, talk to any parent and anyone about it. And the interesting thing about that is that has allowed us to meet people in all different walks of life with all different areas of expertise and willingness of their own, talents of their own. And that has really helped. Um, but when we're talking about tactics, sometimes we're also just running behind fact checking what comes out of the regulators' mouths or the responsible parties' mouths. Well, they don't have a problem lying or greenwashing or misrepresenting facts or intentionally misinterpreting data So a lot of our time, unfortunately, is having to fact check people we shouldn't have to fact check, because DOE, we just went to a meeting a few weeks ago where DOE is basically telling people that exposure to radioactive elements isn't dangerous. And it's unfortunate that a lot of people in the room were accepting that. And so we're having to go back to the basics of that's not true. And this is why, and you shouldn't have to do that with the United States government. So, but that is still where we are. And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult, is because if someone calls the responsible parties, the project directors for Boeing or NASA or the Department of Energy, they will be told that there are no impacts to public health that people living surrounding the site need be worried about. And that's not true.
The Department of Toxic Substances Control, again, that's DTSC. And by the way, DOE acronym is Department of Energy. Our lives are inundated with acronyms. The DTSC, that government agency, and the Boeing company continue to say that contamination does not come off site. And that is contrary to independent reports, peer-reviewed journal reports, independent data, even sister agency data from the Water Board and the Air Board. And it amazes me that they are able to blatantly lie about that. They continue to say it, but there's no force stopping them. That's what drives me insane, is that you can put the truth in front of them, even from their own data, from their own reports, and they will still push forward. It's like there is no accountability.
Not only will they say it, they print it.
Yeah.
They print that there is no pathway for impacts to public health from contamination. But as Melissa always points out, the contamination isn't in barrels up there. It's just in the soil. We're talking about soil and groundwater contamination that is not contained and is subject to erosion and gravity, forces of gravity. So you would think it would be illegal. You think it'd be illegal, right? If they had a public meeting and their, people, concerned community members are coming to find out if they're safe, and that regulators tell them that they are.
That was really the next question that I was going to dive into, was the powers of regulatory capture. So I think a lot of people don't quite understand how that works and how powerful of a force that is, because right, like you see a regulatory agency is like, okay, they exist to make sure they exist to be a watchdog for corporations, right? Like on paper. But that's not how it works when you get to these trans multinational corporations, especially ones like Boeing that are producing weapons. Like, I could talk about what's happening in Gaza right now, but it's all interrelated. Please talk more about regulatory capture.
Yeah, I want to share one of my favorite quotes. It's by Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Yes, I love that quote. And I actually was thinking about that when you guys were speaking. So that's perfect. I did an episode on Upton Sinclair. Big fan.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's what is the problem here. And some people don't understand. So regulatory capture is when there are too many different interests, especially corporate interests, builders' interests, even political interests, that make it hard for the agency to follow their own mission statement. The Department of Toxic Substance Control doesn't follow their own mission statement. But Jenny has been doing amazing work with coalitions across California of other impacted communities and NGOs, and they're working together to try to force reform on this government agency, because until that changes from the inside out, it doesn't matter how much you shout. It doesn't even matter if you sue. They will find a way to twist it and bend it to meet their goals, to not do a cleanup. Jenny, do you want to talk about that a little?
I do, but first I want to just mention that we did sue, right? So DTSC went into a backdoor deal with Boeing and gutted our cleanup agreements. We had cleanup agreements from 2010 that guaranteed a background cleanup on NASA and DOE's portions, and then the 2007 guaranteed that Boeing did sign, because Boeing didn't sign the 2010. The 2007 was supposed to be a cleanup that considered the land use, the zoning of the local areas. What Boeing and DTSC did was they changed the cleanup standards. So we've been fighting for a residential with garden cleanup. And so what they did is they said, sure, you can still have a residential with garden cleanup, but now we're going to leave far more contaminants than we were planning on, but we're still going to call it the same thing.
They changed the calculations.
Yes, they
They
changed
changed
the
the numbers. They kept the label.
The environmental, the manipulation of the environmental data has
Yes.
been pervasive. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. It is nonstop, and it is done by the responsible parties, and it should be stopped by the regulators. DTSC should receive those documents and say, hey, this isn't health protective. It doesn't line up with agreements that both parties have signed into. And so therefore we are not going to approve this. But what DTSC has done at the Santa Susana Field Lab is they have allowed the regulator to let themselves out of their own agreements. And that is a clear-cut example of regulatory capture. They are not enforcing the agreements that they have agreed to. Instead, they are in backroom deals, letting the regulators out of them. So we sued because that backroom deal didn't allow for two things that CEQA says it's supposed to allow for. California Environmental Quality Act requires both the opportunity for public input and environmental review when you make substantive changes to a cleanup document. So they went into this agreement. They didn't do either one of those things. So we sued along with Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles and PEER, which is Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. So we sued the state, and what did DTSC do? They put $2 million taxpayer dollars to fight us in court. They're doing the opposite of what they're mandated to do and the opposite of what their mission statement claims they are doing. They're actually representing the polluters that they're supposed to be regulating. And that was so disheartening. Melissa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, the Boeing lawyers and the DTSC lawyers sat next to each other in court the whole time, whispering back and forth on strategy against the community member. And all we're trying to do is have transparency and follow law. That's not too much to ask. But again, the cleanup that we want from the Boeing company, that, imagine that, to remove dangerous contamination that's giving our kids cancer, that's going to cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. And at every turn, we call it a death by 1,000 paper cuts. At every turn, they've chopped something, cut something, renamed something. They have no limit in their budget to fight us. And the cleanup that was supposed to be done by 2017, the full cleanup has not begun. And they do what they want. Pretty much anything they ask, they get. Even from not only the Department of Toxic Substances Control, we see that at the Water Board. Even though the Water Board, I applaud them for creating a stronger pollution discharge permit a few years ago. That was excellent. Most recently, we won a victory along with Heal the Bay and the Toyo Shumash Foundation and the Water Keepers to strengthen that permit. So that when it rains, again, because the contamination is loose in the soil, it creates toxic sludge and rainwater, and it just goes right down into the LA River on the front and down the Cayugas Creek watershed, hits that watershed in the back towards Simi Valley. And we were able to convince the Water Board that Boeing needed to use new technology to detect PCBs and PFAS, which are two very long-lasting, persistent toxic chemicals groupings. And we won. So that was huge. That was we've never had any kind of victory against Boeing like that before. But then recently, with this new permit in place, Boeing gets fined whenever they exceed those pollution limits. The Water Board put out a document showing that Boeing could have been fined as much as $480 million
Wait,
for
how much
2
do you
years.
think that they paid?
Yeah.
Jordan? How much, if you were to guess, if you had
Anybody.
a $400 million bill,
480 million. Yeah.
what do you
How
think?
much did Boeing pay?
What's a deal? If you
10
were a
million.
regulator, 10 million.
They paid $600,000. That's it.
What?
Yeah, from
And because they
480.
agreed, sorry.
Yeah. And then because Boeing took that deal, they canceled the public hearing where we would have had an opportunity to say, of course we want you to enforce this outrageous fine because, you know, Boeing is never going to do the cleanup out of the goodness of their heart. They're only going to do it when it hurts their pocketbooks. And that kind of a fine every 2 years, maybe they'd start to do, consider doing a cleanup that would remove the contamination at source so they wouldn't have these kind of fines. And until they do that kind of a cleanup, they're going to have these kind of fines. So that's why they were so smart with that backroom deal that Ginny talked about. They also included a provision in the water board that said when they're done with their so-called cleanup, they don't have to be regulated by the water board anymore.
See, but this
So
idea of not enforcing the enforceable, right?
Mhm.
These fines are available as elements to bring polluters into compliance. And what we see in California is that the regulators of air, water, soil contamination are reluctant to actually use the only enforcement mechanisms available to them, and that is the evidence of regulatory capture. They won't even, give them the slap on the wrist because Boeing can afford to pay those fines.
I mean, I grew up in Northern California. I see it all the time with PG&E. All the wildfires that they've caused.
yeah, and I think I've heard things about like I got a comment on my TikTok today about how it's not really NASA's fault. Like I'm sure they could pay for it. If they could pay for it, they would. And obviously that's not true. We work with elected officials who make sure that their budget covers the cleanup. It's just not being done. But the other thing I want to point out, if you were to purely strip this down to finances, my daughter's cancer treatment cost almost $2 million.
For one
And she
person.
is for one kid, and she is one of over 100 children who live within a few miles of the Santa Susana field lab, and some of them have had more intense cancer treatments than her, more expensive. So that's not even looking at the cost of life. That's not looking at finances of households where 50% of childhood cancer households go bankrupt. Um, Often the mom will leave her job if she had one to become a full-time caregiver. They run out, it's just the way that what am I trying to say? Apologize. There's fringe costs that ripple effect out. I'm not even talking about those costs. I'm just talking about treatment costs. I'm not talking about the value of a kid's life cost. I'm just talking about medical costs, $2 million. So really what Boeing is doing, instead of paying for the cleanup that they should pay for, they're pushing the cost onto the people. We financially have to bear it. We physically have to bear it, and
Psychologically and emotionally.
Taxpayers fund all the research that goes into this scientific development as well. So
right.
it's
And,
like
and
this,
again, Boeing has
this take
government contracts. So even if it's not directly tax money, it is. And
public research, yeah.
yeah, it's so backwards. It is. I don't even have the words to say how I feel about that, especially when I'm burying my daughter's friends and they didn't even get a chance to live to 10 years old because Boeing is concerned about their stockholders and their profit margins. It is unfathomable how anyone can sleep at night knowing that that is the cost to a community.
When I moved out here, I had a healthy amount of skepticism about, the government. And however, I don't think anything can prepare you for being in the middle of something like this and watching step by step what all the players are willing or aren't willing to do, and watching people lie and skew the perception of the public purposefully. That and it's not a one-off. when you're in it and you're going to meeting after meeting, you start seeing where the slogans are.
It's a decades-long cover-up, absolutely.
Yeah, it is perspective changing.
And the greenwashing that Boeing does, let me tell you, it is offensive. Um, they bring hikers in. They open up the Santa Susana Field Lab on Earth Day, and they bring in hikers from the public. They allow them to hike through the contaminated site because many of the buildings are gone. So the wildlife has grown up around it. And they're not warned. They're warned that they could get a sunburn. They're warned about mosquito bites. I've read the waiver for this hike. It
But
never
they do have
warns
to
them.
sign it. They do have to sign at the bottom the fine print that none of them are reading that says that Boeing can't be held responsible if there are impacts to their health.
No, to their health and their children's health. It actually lists 2 generations. But they're not warned about the contamination. And this is Boeing's idea of getting out of a cleanup to save hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's bigger than that. If you don't mind me expanding on this topic a little longer,
Yeah,
Jordan.
yeah, please do.
So the Santa Susana Field Lab, there's something really unique about it. Not only is it toxic, not only is it really close to populations, most toxic sites are not. The other thing that is unique that we touched on is that we have some historic cleanup agreements. The background cleanup agreement is to remove all man-made contamination. And you would imagine when someone says toxic cleanup of a hazardous site, that would be the goal, always. It is, in fact, almost never the goal. They consider polluter cost as a balance, a part of the equation of how much will get cleaned up. And
Like it's collateral damage.
yeah, and so public health and environmental restoration are not the main goals of most toxic cleanups across America. So the fact that we have on the books this data driven instead of calculations that the polluters can mess with and consider how much contamination can you get before you die. They're actually
Mhm.
trying to think about how much are we allowed to leave before a person dies instead of how can we remove all the contamination. That's what I assumed would happen at a cleanup site. That is not what happened. So here we have this historic data-driven background cleanup that any man-made contamination is to be removed. It's brilliant in its simplicity and in its data-driven aspect, right? And that does not exist, as far as we know, that does not exist anywhere else in America. That this is even on the books. That's what Boeing fought so hard in that background deal to even though they didn't sign it to background, to make sure that couldn't exist at any aspect of their cleanup. They took it after the settlement agreement. They took out even the mention of it in all their later cleanup documents because it could set a new precedent for what cleanups look like across America. And there are thousands of Superfund sites in America. There are so many radioactive sites in America, and most people have no idea. So if we got this cleanup of what is, even though it is a very toxic site, it is a very dangerous site. To be, in all honesty, if you were to compare it to all the other toxic sites in America, it is not a big site. It is not as dangerous as some of these other. Gosh, talk to people in Savannah River. That I would be terrified. Um, so so if we got this, and we are well resourced. Most of these other toxic sites are put in areas we call sacrifice sites. They're largely socioeconomically disadvantaged, communities of color. They don't have the resources to fight back. Just the fact that we live in the Los Angeles area and we have our newspaper is the LA Times that's internationally read, that alone is a huge weapon in, a tool in the hands of the people. We have celebrities who have kind of come in and out of this issue, like the Kardashians showed up. That was huge. We have the ability to have a lot of educated community members, highly educated community members. There's some affluent areas in this community. Um, those are resources that other sites don't have. So not only do we have the most comprehensive cleanup agreement maybe ever, we probably also have the best chance of getting a comprehensive cleanup. because of all the resources that our community has. So I think that we are a huge threat to polluters because of the precedent that we could set here. And I think that's my hypothesis of why Boeing, NASA, and the Department of Energy are fighting so hard for what is a relatively small cleanup.
Because they don't want to have to replicate it elsewhere.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Because that's one of the issues of the United States being such a geographically enormous country, is that we have this perception that we can continue to make messes and not clean it up, and it's never going to catch up with us. But that's why, people in Santa Monica may have no idea where Simi Valley is. And that between the two of us, there's this, this site that has the potential to affect going both ways. I think the geographic expanse kind of works against us because people always think it's so far away, but they're not thinking about wind, fires, which are increasing in frequency, and the idea that some of these contaminants are so long lasting. We're
Yeah, to
talking
your point,
radioactive contamination lasting tens of thousands of years for their hazardous life.
about fires, I actually wanted you guys to talk about the Woolsey fire, which happened in 2018 at the site, but the media wanted to report that it was near the site.
Yeah, I don't think it was a mistake that it was called, what did they call it? The Woolsey Fire, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Woolsey Canyon is next to the Santa Susana Field Lab. When we have
Mhm.
photographic evidence, it started on the Santa Susana Field Lab.
It should have
At
been
the site.
called the SSFL fire for sure.
Yeah, yeah, but then people would have realized how bad that is and would have panicked. Um, we always said that that would be one of the most dangerous ways for that contamination to become mobilized and reach the community. And we all know how far dust can move, but I'm sorry, but ash and smoke are capable, the long range that can move during a large wildfire. But when that is burning up radioactive plants, because again, many of these materials, radioactive materials, and even many chemical materials, they have natural qualities about them. So that's why when the kids in Japan were bombed during World War II, they found I believe it was the strontium 90 in their teeth. Their bodies absorbed it because it thought it was natural calcium. So it stuck it in their bones just like your body should do when you get calcium. The plants are the same. It takes it up into their structure and it stays radioactive there. It stays toxic. That doesn't mitigate the dangerousness. It just puts it into a new form. Well, now if it catches on fire and becomes ash, now you have radioactive ash. And because ash is so easy to move, especially during the Woolsey fire with, 75-mile-an-hour winds, the transmission of that is terrifying. Jenny, do you want to tell them about how we were able to help with the study and the limitations of that study?
Yes. That's kind of where I came in an active way because I went to field school for archaeological work. And so I understood how to do the sample collection. Marco Kaltofen, in partnership with Fairwinds Energy Education on the East Coast, had contacted Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles because they knew that the DTSC had released a statement saying that the public was safe. Marco Kaltofen is a scientist who studies radiation, specifically, and he has family, I think, in Camarillo. And he was like, I'm not going to take their word for it. And PSRLA tapped Melissa and said, can you do data collection? Can you go to people's homes and collect, a tablespoon of soil and dust and send it to Fairwinds? And she asked me if I would. And then here we are, almost 10 years later, 8 years later, still doing stuff. But we took on that project. I didn't even know how to get around yet. We had just moved in, 6 months before, but thank goodness for GPS. You just put the little address in and you show up at their house with all your stuff and you collect. So that's what we did. We collected 300 and some samples. I don't remember how many. I don't know if you do, Melissa, but we did the data collection and served as chain of command for that project, and that resulted in a peer-reviewed paper that showed that contamination did, in fact, radioactive contamination that could be linked to the site, to SSFL, did leave the site. The limitations of the study were, one, we only had enough time and money to get about 9 miles out. We tried to make sure that the samples were taken at, like, equidistantly from each other, and there weren't any, like, gaping holes where we didn't have, sampling representation, and so we couldn't go further than 9 miles. We couldn't get all the way to, let's say, Santa Monica. We couldn't do that, but, the hottest sample that we had was at the furthest extent of our sampling boundary. So when DTSC says that contamination doesn't come off site, we have peer-reviewed, documented, reports that we helped. We know that we didn't, do anything, that we shouldn't have in the collection. We knew that it was done well. So the other
It's
limitation,
preposterous. I mean, you have Santa Ana winds. You have a wind-driven wildfire. It's not an average fire, so it's
the other
nonsensical, really.
limitation is that if I came to your house, Jordan, and I took a sample, the areas in which I took a sample are finite. We're looking at microparticles, particles that could be inhaled.
Hmm.
Um, that doesn't tell you what's 5 feet away from you. You can't
Yeah.
see it. It's not waving at you. So it was a game of luck to go in, and find ash or dust on someone's ceiling fan and send it across the country.
We also saw an outbreak of brain cancers, terminal brain cancers, right after the Woolsey fire, shortly after the Woolsey fire. And Dr. Marco Kaltofen said that he feels that there was a direct correlation between those people's inhalation of potentially radioactive smoke and ash and their brain cancers. He said that this is not the only site he's seen brain cancers, terminal brain cancers, adult and children brain cancers happen immediately after the Woolsey fire with this kind of radioactive exposure. And people who maybe would think that they were safe were some of the people who died from it. There was a man working in Okora Hills. The fire started and he realized he left all of his important documents in his briefcase. He raced back, was inhaling the smoke, and he ended up having 3 brain tumors that he died from 2 years later. And he was super healthy, like Mr. Athletic, Mr. Health Nut. And he lived, I believe, in Oxnard, but he was there for work. So there's, and I know we're limited on time. We could do a whole nother 12 hours just talking about, the mistakes in the way that they calculate exposure, how that is based, it's sexist. It's based on a white male lifestyle who weighs exactly 180 pounds, who is exactly 5'6". And that was based back in the 1950s. And the DTSC, even though there's plenty of data showing that is not the most protective standard of how much a person can be, exposed to radiation based off a full-size man, they continue to use that. And they don't consider a lot of the new research like Dr. Marco Kaltofen did about microdosing. Like if you ingest or if you inhale a micro amount of radiation, it can be enough to trigger the cancer sequence. It can create DNA damage. And again,
it lodges in your, and it lodges in your,
yeah,
it can lodge in your
body.
lungs and then continue to radiate over as you're going on about your life, which is kind of terrifying to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things I think about cancer that the public may not understand and that the regulators certainly aren't willing to explain about how dangerous this site is. You don't have to be on site to be at risk. You don't have to live within 2 miles, which we have a study that shows a 60% higher cancer incidence rate, 2 miles compared to 5 miles. A lot of people read that. It was a federally funded study at the Santa Susana Field Lab. People read about that and said, "Oh, I'm safe as long as I'm not within 2 miles." That's actually not what the study says. It was looking at correlation, but part of the educational outreach that Ginny and I do is letting people know it's going all the way down the LA River into Long Beach, and then it goes into the Pacific Ocean. And like Ginny said, some of these have 10,000-year half-lives. Some of them have 500,000-year hazardous lives. PCBs, they don't break down in the environment. They bioaccumulate. The lead that we see on site that is getting out into the community. These are very, very toxic, hazardous materials that you only need a micro exposure to. One thing else that they're looking at now, they're just starting to research, NASA actually is starting to research, because this whole idea of occupying Mars Mars actually gets a lot of solar radiation because of the atmosphere. And so they're doing more research on radiation and what that does to the body and the DNA damage. And there is some strong evidence, early evidence, that DNA damage can be inherited by further generations. So that means if your grandpa was exposed to the Santa Susana Field Lab radiation, there is a possibility that any damage to his DNA, even if he didn't get cancer, but if the DNA damage happened, great, 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 great grandchildren may become more susceptible to cancer. These are like worst case scenarios that the DTSC says, well, we don't have enough science now to prove that, so we're not going to even consider it. Instead of saying we should take the most protective measures possible, because the more science is around, the more horrible we realize these contaminants are. Nobody's ever said, oh, it wasn't as bad. Lead isn't as bad for you as we thought. It's always, lead is way worse for you than we thought. That is the trajectory of science, that we find out how dangerous and long lasting much of this contamination is. That is not being used as a safeguard right now.
And that's a great segue to nuclear energy discussion.
Well, yeah, but look at the time.
Let's do a part 2.
Okay.
I have more questions.
Yeah.
And I apologize we talk so much, but I really appreciate you giving us an opportunity to share all this, because when the world is just on Twitter and you have less than a minute, it's very hard to share this kind of information.
I'm very much, I created my show to have long format conversations like this. So again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join the show. We'll talk offline and we'll get a part 2 scheduled. Once I have this all chopped up and edited, I'll send you both a copy.
Oh, wonderful.
Before we go though, can you just shout out your website? How can people get a hold of you? What's next for Parents Against SSFL?
www.parentsagainstssfl, like SantaSusanaFieldLab.com. We're on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Our next step is trying to get our elected officials. They passed motions that they would sue if the cleanup agreements were weakened. They have been, but no lawsuit has been started. No lawsuit has been filed for that. So we are trying to push LA Supervisor Lindsay Horvath. We're hoping she will become our champion and that she might help us. The best supervisor on the Ventura County side would be Janice Parvin. It is in her district. Sorry, that was my son's school calling. The best contact to get this lawsuit going on the Ventura County side would be Supervisor Janice Parvin. It is in her district. And again, these motions were passed to sue. So it makes sense that they follow up now. And this is the time, because Boeing said they will start the cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Lab this summer. So if we do not have action within the next few months, we lose permanently. Boeing will do this shoddy cleanup that leaves almost all of the contamination on site. They're going to call it health protective cleanup, and they're going to turn it into a public park, according to them. That is the plan. And
they already have some of the signs up.
We're essentially letting people know it's going to become Cancer Town here. This is going to be our permanent future.
Not okay. Not okay at all. Keep up the fight, listeners. Did you lose me?
Thank you. Melissa, I'm sorry for interrupting you on your outro. That was terrible. I apologize. We'll hear from you soon.
Sorry.